Okay, so to take off where we were. So we were talking about Milton's Paradise Lost and the fact that T.S. Eliot claimed that Milton was not thinking when he was writing it. So I wanted to explain that a little bit better. Um, so I said that Paradise Lost is it's a Christian allegory, right? And as an allegory, it means that characters can represent abstractions, right? And allegory, the allegory, by the way, is a very popular verse form in the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. By the way, another poem, if you want to read another one, you might want to read The Fairy Queen, and it's actually also this is by Edmund Spenser. This you will find also in the document, and it is once again it's a didactic religious poem. Also, you could put this in the it is similar to Milton's insofar as the sound is beautiful. I would recommend reading the first. I mean, it's a very long poem, but if you want to just read the introduction and the first few stanzas of the first book, you might be lulled into a sort of a spell too, for different reasons. But at any rate, the idea is that Milton has a fixed idea, right? Okay, and it's a didactic. He's writing to sort of instruct us about what he thinks about. I mean, we might say it might be about morality, right? So he has his fixed idea, and he writes to sort of instruct us things about good and evil, and let's just say Christian doctrine, right? So when it is learned in one aspect is the fact that yes, there are a lot of you're probably aware of the fact that 17th century religious thought is fairly developed. It's very, the notion of grace or redemption. These are, for us, they are fraught with complications, and there's a lot of subtleties, right? So Milton would write, let's say there would be passages in this poem where that would illustrate these, I would say, religious ideas. But the idea is that he has these sort of ideas that are already fixed in his mind, and he uses the verse, right, to explain these fixed ideas. And for T.S. Eliot, that isn't thinking. That's just sort of using, language as sort of a pretext to illustrate an idea, to sort of, we could say, is to dress the idea as if you're sort of putting a nice outfit on it, right? But he states that he doesn't use the verse to actually think. He's already sort of thought before. He already has his ideas. So he says so because of this, he falls into this trap, and also once again because the sound is so. I mean, it is beautiful sounding, right? And so because of this, T.S. Eliot says this is sort of leads to sort of corruption to the state of English poetry, and he goes so far to say is that this is sort of this corruption. Milton is sort of the evil bandit in the story of English poetry. He goes on to say is that the influence of Milton was so powerful, is that he influenced a great number of poets in the 18th century, even through the 19th century, and we're going to talk about the Romantic poets. And you can hopefully you'll understand the role that Eliot is giving himself. He's saying that we need to come out of this spell, and he's sort of saying that we have been under this spell for centuries, and I am the one to wake us up out of this spell and have people thinking and feeling at the same time, right? So the antidote to this, or one of the possible antidotes to this, according to Eliot. So, but this is a good place to start. This is a good place to sort of, this is sort of a map to what you might want to think or not about this stuff. An antidote to this, we could talk about this sort of Miltonic, I would say, sonorous verse, would be, according to Eliot, a poet called John Donne, who is, once again, you can find him in the list of 17th century poets. And you'll notice I've called him a metaphysical poet, which is a little bit, it's an unfortunate label, but that is what he is referred to as. And there's also a reference to what is referred to as the metaphysical conceit, which comes from the Italian, which is called the concetti, what they call the concetti, which is a sort of a very usually it's a metaphor that is very finely wrought, and that it can express a subtle idea, right? And so the idea is with first of all, John Donne, he had a different kind of he was a different kind of a thinker, and there were different kind of emotions going on with John Donne, with John Donne's poetry. So T.S. Eliot he's saying that we don't read the John Donne, and there are other poets, but let's say John Donne and the metaphysical poets, we don't read them enough. We should read them more. We should look at the way they made verse, because they are sort of in keeping with the Shakespearean tradition of not divorcing thinking from feeling. They don't kind of just want you to sweep you away with emotion because of good sound, right? So John Donne, it should be just a reminder, or try to give an idea of what his mind was like. He studied law, right? He studied law, and a lot of people say he has sort of a legal mind, right? And he is a fairly paradoxical thinker. You're not going to be sort of swept away with general, I would say, sort of generous, wholesome feeling when you read John Donne, right? You kind of get stuck halfway through when you read a line of John Donne, and you kind of wonder why he put this word in there, right? There's a lot of words that stick out in John Donne. And when he writes about death, he says, "Death be not proud," right? He can be fairly contemptuous, right? And also he has a lot of wit. He's kind of funny. He can tease people. For example, there's a lot of, you could read, there's a lot of poems that you could read. I've just included two. One was his first elegy on jealousy, which is a poem he wrote to one of his mistresses. And the opening lines are, "Nature's light idiot, I taught thee to love, and in that sophistry thou hast proved too cunning," right? So what he's saying in this poem, just to give you an idea of the kind of thing that John Donne's going to be talking about, he's saying that his mistress was fairly unsophisticated, of course, because John Donne, of course, is an incredibly sophisticated, courtesan. He's writing a poem to his mistress, saying that when first they were together, he basically had to educate her in everything, because she missed. For example, he would send her flowers, and they were arranged in a specific way, and she just didn't understand it, so he had to teach her. And there's also the third character, of course, seeing as he's writing to his mistress, is going to be the husband, right? And obviously this, you can imagine how the husband is a very obtuse fellow. So these John Donne is sort of giving flowers to the mistress in a certain way that only the mistress learns to understand. And obviously the husband doesn't understand any of it, and he's sort of there's a lot of sort of jokes that he doesn't get. So at the end he goes on to say that, this is ridiculous. I've sort of created someone. I've made you be, much finer and much more, an interesting companion than you were before. And then you go off and you leave me, and that was a really stupid thing to do, because then you're just going to go and, benefit some other person, right? And what a waste of time. What a stupid idea. I shouldn't have done this. So you can see that it's a pretty strange love poem to write, right? It's not exactly the sighing poet who, it's pretty bitter, right? And at the same, so there was a pretty complex emotion going on. It's fairly intricate, right? Just like this sort of image of the flowers. And that's one thing that these John Donne, especially the metaphysical poets, are known for having, is very, very very sophisticated images that are supposed to adequately represent a complicated thing, right? And the sound, when you read, I'm not really sure how I feel about John Donne. Sometimes at one point I read him pretty much, he doesn't he won't sweep you away. He's never. Some poets are going to do that. They're just going to sweep you away, and you follow them, and you feel like you're following them. At who knows what altitude. John Donne is never going. Your feet are never going to leave the ground with John Donne, right? You're sort of, he has a legal mind, right? You're sort of in a strategic game almost, right? That is a lot of what T.S. Eliot is saying. But the argument is to say, when are we most alive? When we're being sort of in a state of nirvana, right? When we can, or are we more alive when we're kind of, in this sort of, I would say, almost a combative thinking, feeling game, right? You might not want to do that at all, but that is how T.S. Eliot saw John Donne. And what's interesting, he's actually, it's always good to know is that here we are in university, and a lot of times there's a lot of stuff on the program, stuff we read or don't. And T.S. Eliot isn't the only one, but he is he is probably the reason why you have read, if you have read, and you probably have, a poem or two of John Donne since you've been in college. It's because of T.S. Eliot. He kind of brought him back into vogue, and since then, John Donne has really been very widely read, right? That kind of changed, and so people really wanted to look more into this kind of poetry, right? Reading for different reasons. So that is, I would say, T.S. Eliot. That's probably his most famous idea. This question of what we call the dissociation of sensibility, right? Once again, and his sort of, as you see, we kind of have to go through English history to kind of understand that idea, because his idea goes along with a certain version of the history of English poetry, right? So it has to do with this sort of rupture, schism that happened sort of mid 17th century, when thinking is according to I'm not going to say I never know what to think. I think it's a great idea. I'm not sure how true it is or not. I mean but sometimes that's what usually ideas are like. They're there. You have to. It's hard to know what to do with them. So that's sort of a question to ask. And that might, and you hopefully can see that this, at this time, poetry was really, this is before, I said that, for example, novels are kind of more interesting before movies came out, right? Poetry was read by a lot more people, right? Who sought, they were looking for, it was sort of an important part of the enjoyment that they got out of, leisure, right? It played a much bigger role, and if that is really one of the reasons why it's worth reading old stuff, because it's not someone trying to do it's not necessarily someone trying to do some elitist artsy thing in his own little corner, right? Okay. And another thing to think about is, this is something we've kind of loosely touched on, is sort of the scope. I would say sort of we can talk about the scope and range of English poetry. Notice we've gone back to talking about sort of Spenser, and we've gone to talking about Milton, and we've sort of seen that poetry was sort of asked to do different things, right? It had sort of it had a philosophical range, right? Sociologically, it touched. It went sort of, we could say it went higher and lower, it sort of had more breadth, whereas, and that's arguably one of the reasons why more people read it, right? It was sort of, once again, it was more relevant to their daily life, where it's important to consider that now poetry is usually reserved to, I would say, what we might call the sort of lyrical mode, sort of the individual talking about his or her sort of individual feelings, right? That's sort of what people normally think of when they think about poetry. Whereas if you go back, you think, well, wait a second, there was, and unfortunately a lot of it was religious, but there were these sort of, there were epics, which might talk about, there was a lot of action, there's a lot of action scenes in poetry. Now that is something that we don't really think today of let's say, an action movie, right? That's not really something we think of poetry being able to do, right? So that's something to keep in mind, is one of the reasons why you might be frustrated. And to be honest, I'm fairly frustrated with a lot of contemporary. I don't read much contemporary poetry because I feel as if the scope of it, what it's asked to do, less, right? And it doesn't, and strangely, it's become very kind of, we might say, and one of the problems is, yes, a lot of more people read John Donne than they may have before, because there a lot of modern poetry has become extraordinarily sophisticated, I would say the vehicle has become very sophisticated, much like the vehicle is for John Donne and the Metaphysicals, and yet the scope and the range has become very reduced, right? It isn't asked to do as much, right? And it could be argued that makes it less interesting. And if you're writing it, you might ask yourself, if you want to write it, you might want to make it do more. So that is sort of the I would say that's what T.S. Eliot's theories can teach us, and they're more. And I would highly recommend reading them. What is really interesting about T.S. Eliot is that he writes much differently as a poet and as a critic. Even if you don't like him as a poet, and I think a lot of you, I think a few of you have said you really liked reading The Wasteland, and I think you went off to read, because we talked about it, J. Alfred Prufrock. It's really, really worth reading his critical essays. He has this sort of very cool, a lot of people describe it sort of his cool tone. They're extremely simply written, and yet they probe depths. They are kind of the critical essays that have probed, deeper than a lot had before. They were really asking questions, why the heck are we going to write poetry? What kind of sense would that possibly make? So I would say you might really enjoy them. I read them. At one time in my life, I read them, to be honest, with great enjoyment. So maybe moving on, and we're gonna kind of use T.S. Eliot as sort of our guide through here. And so we're gonna look at sort of another aspect that he talked about and that we were just talking about. There is this this idea that poetry has come to be the sort of privileged domain for the super sensitive people as sort of individuals, right? And the idea is, before poetry, unfortunately, it's kind of boring didactic poetry, but it was, called to do a lot more. And that shift, the major time of that shift really happened with, the Romantics. So we're talking about the end of the 18th, early 19th century. And it's, we're looking at the specificity of English poetry. That is something, Romantic poetry is big in England. It's much less big in France. It's important to keep in mind that in France there is what is usually referred to as the symbolist school, right? We can talk about people like Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Mallarmé, Verlaine. These poets wrote, we could say they're post-Romantic, right? And a lot of people can say that a lot of them criticize, Romantic attitudes, right? And that is unfortunately, I have a list of what we notice. We're talking about the Victorian period when we talk about French symbolist poetry. To be honest, that is really not where English poetry shines, right? I perhaps could have included other poets, but and this is something you might try getting into. The mid 19th century sort of self-critical, I would say what we call it sort of critical thinking poetry is not really English poetry's strong point. And that's, by the way, one of the reasons why when T.S. Eliot writes, let's say, The Wasteland, he cites Baudelaire. He says, "Hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère." He really knew. He has really interesting essays, if you want to read them, about French symbolist poetry. He knew it like the back of his hand. he was also very critical of it too, fortunately. Now, so the idea is this. In the Romantic period, notice we have 6 poets. And by the way, this is notice here, we're talking about a lot of men, right? This is a lot of, we're going to have, there's going to be another edition. We're going to continue this next week. But we're talking about this sort of this, the tradition here. And we've seen it's a really masculine tradition. Notice that we've said that here we're getting into the 19th century. And we have seen that I really wanted to stress the fact that women novelists are preeminent in English literature, and I think, which means in world literature, and I really think it's a crying shame that they aren't more widely read around the world. But that's just the breaks, what it is. But there are, as far as English poetry is concerned, in England, there are fewer, as far as what we call, the great Romantic poets. We're talking about 6 men here, right? So that's, and we're going to say bad things about this. We're going to say I'm going to try to come up to sort of Eliot's and sort of my criticism of Romantic poetry. But notice there, by the way, just on this little aside, there is on the other hand, there are 3, and it's sort of, maybe it's a good thing in the Victorian period. So we're talking about the mid-late 19th century. There are 3 amazing women poets. I would say the first one to really keep, I would say the one that really, I would say as far as the form of her poetry was revolutionary. Even though she was a very mild-mannered, very private, intimate New England woman, Emily Dickinson. The American poet. I listed 4 or 5 poems of her to read. Tell the Truth But Tell It. There's the last one you'll say. It's called Tell the Truth But Tell It Slant. These are very short, succinct poems with little dashes and spaces, very kind of elliptical constructions, and they're extraordinarily dense, right? And we in these cases, they're a perfect illustration of, I would say, the fusion of thinking and feeling, right? Of course, there might be some exceptions, but for example, Tell the Truth But Tell It Slant, we'll say is Tell the Truth But Tell it Slant, success in circuit lies. So circuit is sort of a circle, right? It's doing something circuitously, is not direct. Success in circuit lies. That's usually, notice, circuit means we're doing something in a convoluted way. Instead of saying success lies in circuit, success in circuit lies, changing of the word order, we have these sort of very dense, alliterated 2-syllable words, right? We have this very compact and sort of trenchant style that is really new in English poetry. And she inaugurated that. That's a huge thing, right? She remains relevant today. You might I would love to say more about Elizabeth Barrett, the 2 English poets and women poets on there being Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Christina Rossetti, but I'll lead you to discover that for yourself. Wonderful stuff. But they're more in the sort of traditional, more in keeping with the other male traditional writers, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Robert Browning, which is not, what I'm saying is not quite true. But let's just say Dickinson's poetry is more of a radical departure. Now, so the idea is, unfortunately, I would love to have a big discussion of these the 6 Romantic poets that you have here. You can go find them for yourself. But note, the idea is this, that Eliot criticizes them because, first of all, he says they read too much Milton. And it's true that of the 6, there are actually only one, I think, is not really Miltonic. Oh, there are 2 that are less. I would say Keats, the last 2, we notice Blake, Miltonic, Wordsworth, Miltonic, Coleridge a little bit less, but we'll go on. By the way, the prelude by William Wordsworth is almost, in many ways, sort of it just like Paradise Lost is an epic. It's a sort of but notice it's a personal epic. A lot of people actually compare the prelude by Wordsworth to La Recherche du Temps Perdu de Proust. It is sort of this. It's a story. It's sort of the epic of the individual life, something like that. But the idea is that these writers are really focused on this sort of, they're isolated individuals, and they're really talking about the sort of their individual emotions and their personal experience, right? And that really becomes the focus of poetry, right? And it could be argued that, that's sort of damaged poetry. Like, poetry is very often, when we think of something being poetic, we think of certain emotions, right, in a certain context, and it could be said that that kind of limits the range and scope. It could be said. You could argue that. You could, of course, argue the opposite of that, but that is a very broad simplification. I would love to say much more about this, but let's leave it at that. So we're going to finish up this discussion, right? Next week, we're going to get to more, the more modern stuff, hopefully, right? But maybe you might want to go out and reading this stuff. I would really go and read Keats. Read his. He's the Romantic, I would say, sort of an exception, because I would say he's more Shakespearean than Miltonian. Also, he is a really good, I think I talked already about Keats's great critique of Shakespeare as in his letters. We've already talked about that. So you might want to sort of experience him firsthand. And these are really good reads. La Belle Dame sans Merci, on first looking at the Chapman's Homer. So you I would say look into that yourself. Have fun with it. Write me if you have any questions. And I wish you the best of luck. You can hand in, once again, with your assignments. You can once again sort of start writing a story. You can start writing a poem. You can, I like what you have sent me. I'm going to send you later in the week your grades, and it's going to be difficult because I wrote on your copies, so I'm going to try to figure out a way to maybe send a photo of that. It's going to be a little bit difficult. We're going to see how it goes. It really depends on how everything goes on. So I hope you're doing well, that you have the time to enjoy reading and enjoy writing. But I know it's a little bit of a difficult time, but I hope it's going well all the same. Take care.